So you want to build Disneyland. Take a plot of empty orange groves outside Los Angeles, build a castle in the middle of it, fill the rest with rides, characters, and a train that circles the whole thing, and charge people at the gate to come in and pretend they're somewhere else for a day. It sounds almost quaint compared to how the company operates now. A single park, a handful of attractions, built on land that was, quite literally, farmland a year before it opened. Here's the problem. A theme park isn't really a ride business. It's a business built around getting tens of thousands of people to physically show up in one place every single day, and then engineering everything about that visit. The lines, the food, the gift shops, the parade schedule, so that each of those people spends meaningfully more money than the price of their ticket alone. And unlike almost any other kind of entertainment, you can't just build it once and let it run. The rides wear out. The paint fades. The technology behind the attractions becomes dated within a decade, sometimes less, and the whole thing has to be continuously rebuilt, piece by piece, while it's still open and full of paying guests. Let's start with what it actually costs to build a park like this from nothing, because the original Disneyland is a genuinely interesting case study in just how wrong an initial budget can be for a project this ambitious. The park was originally budgeted at somewhere around a few $1,000,000 and ended up costing roughly $17 million by the time it actually opened, a massive overrun for the era, driven by the simple fact that nobody had really built anything quite like this before. There was no established playbook for constructing a themed environment at this scale, with this many custom-built attractions, this level of detail in the landscaping and architecture, so almost every phase of construction ran into problems nobody had budgeted for because nobody had faced them before. That overrun problem hasn't gone away with modern parks. If anything, it's gotten more extreme, because the bar for what counts as an acceptable attraction has risen enormously since the 1950s. A single major modern attraction, the kind built around a specific film franchise with elaborate animatronics, ride vehicles, and immersive set design, can cost hundreds of millions of dollars on its own, sometimes well over $1 billion when you're talking about an entire new themed land rather than a single ride. That's not a typo. A themed land, several rides and restaurants built around one cohesive story and aesthetic, can cost more than most entire standalone theme parks did a generation earlier. Now, here's where the economics get genuinely different from almost any other entertainment business. A movie, once it's finished, costs almost nothing extra to show to another million people. A theme park ride is the opposite. Every single guest who rides it wears down the same physical hardware a tiny bit more, and that hardware has to be inspected, maintained, and eventually completely refurbished, on a schedule that has nothing to do with how much money the ride is bringing in that particular month. Rides get shut down for weeks or months at a time for what's called a refurbishment, which sounds like routine maintenance, but is often a genuinely major undertaking, replacing show elements, updating animatronics, repainting sets that have faded under years of sun exposure, and doing all of it during a period when that attraction is generating zero revenue while still requiring a team of skilled technicians to actually do the work. This is a genuinely brutal contrast to a streaming show or a movie, where the content, once made, just sits there generating revenue indefinitely with almost no additional cost. A physical ride is closer to owning a fleet of very expensive, very specialized vehicles that need constant specialized upkeep, except the vehicles are permanently mounted show buildings that can't just be swapped out or sold when they get old. Let's talk about labor, because a theme park is an extraordinarily labor-intensive business in a way that surprises people who assume the money is mostly in the rides themselves. Every single ride needs an operator, sometimes several, standing there for the entire operating day, loading and unloading guests, running safety checks between every cycle. Every restaurant needs a full kitchen staff. Every character walking around needs a performer inside a costume that can be genuinely brutal to wear for hours in warm weather, plus a handler nearby managing crowd interactions. Custodial staff have to keep an enormous physical space spotless continuously, because park cleanliness is such a core part of the brand experience that letting it slip even slightly does real measurable damage to how guests perceive the entire visit. A single major park can employ tens of thousands of people, and unlike a lot of other large employers, a huge share of that workforce has to be physically present and actively working during the exact hours the park is open, which means labor costs don't really shrink much, even on a slower day, because you still need enough staff on hand to run every ride and every restaurant safely, regardless of whether attendance that day is lighter than usual. Now, ticket pricing, because this is where the business gets genuinely clever and where a lot of the real profit strategy actually lives. The single-day ticket price that gets talked about publicly is really just the entry point into a much larger and more complicated pricing structure. Parking, which sounds like a minor add-on, generates real money at the scale these parks operate because tens of thousands of cars need somewhere to sit for an entire day. And that parking structure itself was an enormous capital investment that now quietly generates steady daily revenue on top of admission. Food and merchandise inside the park are priced at a meaningful premium compared to what the same items would cost outside the gates. And this isn't simply opportunistic pricing. It reflects the genuinely higher cost of operating a restaurant or shop inside a controlled, permitted environment with strict brand and quality standards. But it's also true that once a family has paid for parking, admission, and committed an entire day to being inside the park, they've become a genuinely captive audience with limited alternatives for lunch, which the pricing structure is, quite honestly, built around. Then there's the tiered experience layer that's become an increasingly important revenue driver in recent years. Paid systems that let guests skip standard wait times for popular rides for an additional fee on top of admission. This turns what used to be a purely first-come, first-served experience into something closer to a segmented product, where guests willing to pay more get a meaningfully different, faster experience than guests who aren't, layered directly on top of the standard ticket. It's a genuinely significant shift in how these parks generate revenue because it lets the company extract additional money from the exact same physical capacity. The same number of people riding the same ride, the same number of times per day, simply by changing who gets priority access to it. Let's talk about the intellectual property side of this business, because it's arguably the single biggest structural advantage a company like this has over almost any competing theme park operator on Earth. Most theme parks have to license characters and stories from someone else, paying ongoing royalties for the right to build attractions around properties they don't own. This company owns an enormous library of its own characters, films, and franchises outright, which means when it builds a new attraction around one of them, all of the value generated by that attraction, and by the merchandise and media tie-ins that come with it, flows back into the same company rather than being shared with an outside rights holder. This creates a genuinely powerful flywheel that very few entertainment companies can replicate. A successful film generates enough audience affection to justify building a themed land around it years later. The themed land drives park attendance and merchandise sales. The merchandise and continued park presence keep the franchise culturally relevant, which makes a sequel or a new show built around the same characters a safer investment, which then generates a new wave of audience affection that justifies further expansion of the physical attraction. Very few companies control enough of that entire loop, from original content creation all the way through to the physical experience built around it, to make this flywheel work at the same scale. Now, let's talk about what can go wrong, because even with that structural advantage, this remains a genuinely capital-intensive and vulnerable business in several specific ways. Weather is a real recurring cost that doesn't show up in most people's mental model of a theme park. A hurricane, an unusually rainy season, or even just a stretch of extreme heat can meaningfully depress attendance for weeks, and unlike a lot of businesses, a park's fixed costs, staffing, maintenance, debt service on however the original construction was financed, don't shrink just because fewer people showed up that particular week. Economic downturns hit this business in a genuinely specific way, too, because a theme park vacation is about as discretionary as consumer spending gets. When household budgets tighten, a multi-day trip involving flights, hotels, park tickets, and food inside the park is one of the first things a family cuts, which means attendance and per-guest spending can both decline simultaneously during a recession, compounding the revenue hit at exactly the moment the company's fixed costs haven't gone anywhere. There's a real case study worth walking through here because it shows how quickly a fully booked, seemingly unstoppable business can face a genuine existential threat. When the parks were forced to close entirely for an extended period during a global health crisis, the company went from collecting daily admission, parking, food, and merchandise revenue from tens of thousands of people simultaneously at multiple parks around the world to collecting essentially nothing from that entire business segment for months while still carrying enormous fixed costs, maintenance obligations on rides that couldn't be operated, and a workforce that couldn't be productively deployed in the way the business model depends on. It was a genuinely stark demonstration of something true about this business that's easy to forget when the parks are running normally. The entire revenue engine depends on people being physically present in a specific location, which means any disruption to physical gathering, for any reason, hits this business in a way that a lot of other entertainment companies, particularly ones built around streaming or digital content, simply don't have to worry about in the same way. So how does this business actually work in plain mechanical terms once you strip away all the complexity? Total revenue from admission, parking, food, merchandise, and paid line skip systems, minus labor costs for the tens of thousands of staff required to run the park safely every single operating day, minus the ongoing cost of ride maintenance and periodic refurbishment, minus the amortized cost of building new attractions and themed lands to keep the park feeling fresh enough that people keep coming back, minus royalties and content investment required to keep the underlying franchises culturally relevant enough to justify building attractions around them in the first place. For a major park at full operation, daily operating costs alone, just keeping the lights on, the staff paid, and the rides running safely, can run into the millions of dollars per day, and that's before counting anything spent on new construction that year. Here's the volatility layered on top of that math. Attendance can swing significantly based on factors well outside the company's control. Currency exchange rates affecting how affordable a trip is for international visitors. Gas prices affecting how many domestic families are willing to drive long distances for a vacation. And broader consumer confidence about discretionary spending generally. And because a huge share of the cost structure, staffing, maintenance, debt service is essentially fixed, regardless of daily attendance, even a modest percentage decline in visitor numbers can translate into a much larger percentage decline in actual profit, because that lost revenue was disproportionately the part that would have flowed straight to the bottom line. Let's put together the two versions of a single year for a park like this. In a strong year, a major new attraction opens to genuine excitement and drives a meaningful attendance spike. Per-guest spending on food, merchandise, and paid line skip access comes in strong. Currency conditions are favorable for international visitors, and no major weather event or economic shock depresses attendance for any extended stretch. Under those conditions, the park can generate genuinely excellent operating margins because so much of the incremental revenue from higher attendance flows straight through as profit, once the fixed costs of simply operating the park are already covered. In a difficult year, a new attraction faces construction delays and opens late or over budget. A weaker economy causes families to cut discretionary vacation spending. Unfavorable currency conditions make the trip meaningfully more expensive for a key international visitor segment, and a stretch of unusually bad weather during a peak season depresses attendance during what should have been some of the highest revenue weeks of the year. Under those conditions, margins can compress significantly even while the park still looks, from the outside, completely normal. The castle still lit up every evening, the parade still running on schedule, the gates still opening on time every single morning, regardless of what the actual attendance and spending numbers look like that particular week. The difference between those 2 years can run into hundreds of millions of dollars, and almost none of it shows up as one dramatic headline. It's a slightly softer summer season here, a construction delay on a new attraction there, an unfavorable currency shift compounding quietly against a backdrop of a park that, from the front gate, looks exactly the same either way. The fireworks still go off at closing. The characters still pose for photos. The guest walking through the gate that morning has no real way of knowing whether the company behind that gate is having a genuinely great year or a genuinely difficult one, because nothing about the actual day they're about to have changes based on which version of the year is actually unfolding on a balance sheet they'll never see. So if you ever find yourself dreaming about building something like Disneyland, remember the one thing that actually determines whether a park like this survives. It was never really about how magical any single ride feels in the moment. It's about whether you can keep rebuilding the magic, piece by piece, year after year, faster than it wears out underneath the very people paying to experience it.